Maybe they send a message that doesn't really require a response, hoping you'll keep it going. Maybe they reply to something long after the conversation should have naturally ended. Even short, seemingly meaningless exchanges can be a way for them to maintain a presence in your life. When you reply, it reassures them that the bond isn't completely broken. Their choice of words also reveals a lot. Do they bring up inside jokes? Do they reference old conversations or remind you of things only the two of you understand? These are subtle ways of keeping familiarity alive, as if they're afraid of becoming just another person from your past. They might not even realize they're doing it, but deep down, they are trying to hold on to the emotional connection. Another key sign is how they respond when you pull away. If you take longer to reply or keep your answers short, do they try harder to engage? Do they send follow-up messages or find new excuses to talk? Someone who has moved on won't chase a conversation, but someone who is still emotionally involved will. They fear the growing distance and try to bridge the gap before it becomes permanent. Pay attention to how they react when you share personal updates. Do they ask about your life in detail? Do they remember small things you mentioned weeks or months ago? This isn't just politeness, it's investment. When someone is still emotionally connected, they don't just listen, they hold on to every piece of information, as if it gives them a reason to stay involved. Even in group settings, their communication patterns are revealing. Maybe they don't text you directly, but they always find a way to respond when you say something in a shared group chat. Or they laugh a little too much at your jokes, react to your messages more than necessary, or subtly steer conversations in your direction. These are unconscious attempts to stay close, even when they pretend it's nothing. The strongest sign of all is the cycle. No matter how much time passes, they always find their way back. Maybe they disappear for a while, but eventually, there's another message, another reason to reconnect. When conversations never fully end, neither do the emotions behind them. And when someone keeps talking to you, even when there's nothing left to say, it's because they're not ready to let go. The back and forth can leave you questioning your worth, wondering if you did something wrong or if you somehow caused the person to pull away. But this isn't about you. This is about his internal struggle, one that you cannot fix, no matter how much you might want to. In the coming chapters, we'll explore how this fear of intimacy affects relationships and what you can do when faced with someone who seems to want you, yet cannot seem to fully commit. Understanding the psychological mechanisms behind this behavior is the first step in navigating the emotional complexities of love, intimacy, and human connection. By gaining insight into the unconscious forces at play, you may begin to understand not only the person pulling away, but also the deeper layers of your own emotions and desires. It's only when we confront the shadows within ourselves that we can truly move towards healing and growth. Have you ever experienced the sudden emotional distance from someone you thought was beginning to open up to you? It's as though you could sense a shift in the air, a change that wasn't there before. One moment, he's warm, attentive, and emotionally engaged. The next moment, he seems distant, almost unreachable. You might wonder, what went wrong? Why the sudden withdrawal? What many fail to realize is that this shift often comes from a much deeper, unconscious place, the fear of vulnerability. This fear, more often than not, is a result of psychological defense mechanisms built up over years of life experience. Vulnerability, for some, feels like an emotional exposure too dangerous to endure. And when they sense they are getting too close to being vulnerable with someone, they instinctively pull back. This is not a conscious choice, but a deep-rooted reaction that is hardwired into their psyche. Carl Jung's exploration of the shadow and the anima animus provides critical insights into this phenomenon. The shadow, as Jung described it, represents those aspects of the self that we choose to repress or deny because they are too difficult or painful to confront. These can be memories, emotions, or even aspects of our personality that we deem unworthy or unacceptable. For someone with a fear of intimacy, the shadow is often filled with unresolved emotional wounds, past traumas, abandonment, rejection, that they have learned to hide or suppress. But while we try to hide these aspects from others, they still affect our behavior in profound ways. For many men, this fear of vulnerability is directly connected to their upbringing and the emotional patterns learned from caregivers. If a child grows up in an environment where emotional expression is discouraged or where love was conditional or inconsistent, they often learn to protect themselves by building walls around their hearts. Love becomes something that feels uncertain or even dangerous. Over time, they may develop an avoidant attachment style, one where they crave love but instinctively distance themselves when they sense it is within reach. This dynamic is not just a simple case of fear of rejection. It's a deeply ingrained fear of emotional exposure. Vulnerability requires a level of trust that many avoid because at its core, it represents the possibility of being hurt, of being truly seen and rejected. For some men, the idea of being emotionally exposed is akin to being completely defenseless. To them, this kind of openness feels like walking barefoot through a storm. But why does vulnerability feel so threatening? The answer lies in the intricate workings of the unconscious mind. When someone is beginning to feel close to another person, they may experience an inner battle between the desire for connection and the instinct to protect themselves from emotional harm. The unconscious mind, shaped by past experiences and internalized fears, triggers a response that says, retreat. It's an automatic reaction, one that feels necessary for survival, even if, on a conscious level, the person may not recognize it as such. Jung also introduced the idea of the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine aspects within all individuals. For a man who is pulling away, his own internal animus may be in conflict with his desire for emotional intimacy. On one hand, his animus may push him towards emotional independence, self-reliance, and control, avoiding anything that feels too vulnerable or dependent. On the other hand, his anima, the feminine aspect of his unconscious, longs for connection, intimacy, and emotional bonding. The tension between these opposing forces creates an internal emotional conflict that is often played out in real-life relationships. This conflict can manifest as withdrawal or avoidance when he gets too close to the intimacy that his anima desires, yet his animus fears. The fear of vulnerability is also tied to a deeper, more existential fear, the fear of loss of self. When someone allows themselves to be truly vulnerable, they are, in a sense, surrendering control. They are giving another person the power to hurt them, to reject them, or to change the way they view themselves. This is an incredibly daunting prospect for someone who has built their identity around emotional independence and self-preservation. The very act of opening up to another person can feel like a loss of selfhood, a dissolving of their carefully constructed emotional defenses. However, this fear is not an insurmountable obstacle. Jung believed that the path to true personal growth and healing lies in the process of individuation, the integration of the unconscious with the conscious mind. For someone who fears vulnerability, this process would involve confronting the shadow, the painful emotions and fears they have repressed, and integrating those parts of themselves that have been denied. Only by facing these inner conflicts and embracing their emotional complexity can a person move beyond their fear of intimacy and vulnerability. For a man who is pulling away, this means confronting his deepest fears of emotional exposure and rejection. It means allowing himself to be seen, not just in the light of his strengths, but also in the darkness of his vulnerabilities. It's a long, often difficult journey, but it's one that leads to healing, self-acceptance, and the potential for deeper, more authentic connections with others. As we explore further in the next chapters, we'll examine the ways in which vulnerability and emotional openness are essential to building strong, lasting relationships. We will also discuss how those who fear vulnerability can begin to break down the walls they've built and start the process of healing from within. But before that, it's important to understand that the person who pulls away isn't doing so because of a lack of interest or care. They're simply grappling with their own inner demons, their fear of vulnerability, their unresolved wounds, and their battle for emotional freedom. And only by facing these fears can they learn to let go and fully embrace love. It's a pattern that feels all too familiar. The man who, just when he seems to be getting close, begins to withdraw. There's a pullback that isn't just emotional. It's almost as if he's putting up walls, retreating into himself. If you've ever found yourself wondering why someone who seemed so interested suddenly distances himself, you may be encountering a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism, the fear of rejection. But this fear, while seemingly straightforward, often runs much deeper, feeding into a cycle of self-sabotage that many are unaware of. At the core of this fear is an emotional paradox, the desire for connection and the simultaneous fear of losing it. This fear is not just about being rejected in the traditional sense, it goes much deeper. For some, the fear of rejection is tied to a fundamental belief about their worthiness. From a young age, we internalize messages about ourselves from our parents, peers, and society. These messages, whether overt or subtle, form the basis of our self-esteem and our sense of self-worth. If someone's early life experiences were marked by neglect, criticism, or emotional abandonment, they may develop an unconscious belief that they are not lovable or worthy of true connection. This belief can cause them to fear emotional closeness, fearing that eventually they will be rejected. Jungian psychology explains this dynamic in terms of the shadow, those parts of ourselves that we repress or deny. For a man with a fear of rejection, the shadow often contains a deep sense of inadequacy or emotional scars from past relationships. These scars may have originated from childhood experiences of neglect, abandonment, or failure. As he begins to feel vulnerable, this shadow rises to the surface, whispering fears of unworthiness. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he fears rejection, the more he subconsciously pushes people away to avoid the pain of facing these emotional wounds. One of the most intriguing concepts that Carl Jung explored was the idea of the persona, the mask we wear to the world in order to protect ourselves from judgment. The persona is a social mask, the version of ourselves that we present to others in public. For someone with a fear of rejection, the persona may be an idealized image of confidence and self-sufficiency. This image is designed to keep others from seeing the vulnerabilities underneath, the insecurities, the doubts, and the emotional scars that lie hidden. When this mask begins to crack and true intimacy seems imminent, the fear of rejection intensifies. The person starts to believe that if they allow someone to see their true self, they will be judged, criticized, or worse, rejected. This fear, though deeply unconscious, manifests as withdrawal. Another layer to this cycle of fear and withdrawal is the concept of self-sabotage. At the moment when someone begins to feel that emotional closeness, the fear of being hurt becomes so overwhelming that it triggers a subconscious desire to push the other person away. This can happen in a number of ways: being distant, becoming defensive, making excuses to avoid plans, or even creating conflict where none exists. On the surface, it may appear like a person is acting out of indifference or lack of interest. In reality, they are protecting themselves from a threat that feels all too real, the threat of being rejected and feeling exposed. This behavior often stems from a lack of self-awareness. The person may not realize that their withdrawal is a defense mechanism rooted in childhood experiences or past emotional trauma. For many, this is the only way they know how to deal with the overwhelming fear of being vulnerable. They have learned, through painful experiences, that it is safer to remain emotionally distant than to risk being hurt. However, this emotional distancing ultimately leads to a cycle of loneliness and unfulfilled desires. They push others away just when they need them the most. The fear of rejection also ties into the broader idea of dependency. The fear that, By allowing someone close, they will become dependent on them emotionally and in turn risk losing their sense of independence. For many men, emotional dependence feels like a loss of control, a surrender of autonomy that they are unwilling to accept. This need for emotional independence can lead to emotional withdrawal when intimacy becomes too real. The very act of depending on someone for emotional support, affection, or love feels like an emotional threat, one that they will go to great lengths to avoid. This dynamic also reflects a deep-seated fear of being vulnerable. In many cultures, vulnerability is viewed as a weakness, especially for men. From a young age, many are taught to be strong, self-reliant, and stoic. Expressing emotions, particularly fear or sadness, is often seen as a sign of weakness or inadequacy. For someone who has internalized these beliefs, vulnerability becomes a dangerous territory, one where rejection could not only be emotional, but also lead to a loss of respect or status. The fear of being emotionally exposed is not just about fear of rejection from others, but also about fear of losing oneself in the process. But what if vulnerability, rather than being a weakness, could be the key to deeper emotional connection and healing? What if the very thing that we fear most, rejection, could be the doorway to greater self-awareness, intimacy, and growth? The truth is that overcoming the fear of rejection requires a shift in mindset. It requires embracing the idea that emotional vulnerability is not a threat, but an opportunity, a chance to truly connect with another person and, ultimately, with oneself. Jung's concept of individuation holds the key to breaking this cycle of self-sabotage. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, of integrating the unconscious with the conscious and embracing all parts of the self, the light and the I, shadow. For a man who is afraid of rejection, individuation means confronting the beliefs and fears that drive him to push others away. It means allowing himself to be vulnerable, to face the emotional scars of the past, and to learn that true connection comes not from perfection, but from acceptance. In the next chapters, we will explore how this process of healing can begin, and how overcoming the fear of rejection is not just about becoming open to others, but also about learning to accept oneself. Rejection, rather than being something to fear, can become a pathway to growth and transformation. It's in the moments of emotional exposure that we find the greatest potential for change and emotional freedom. Loss is one of the most primal fears we carry within us. The idea that something, someone, can be taken from us can create an intense sense of dread. For many, the fear of losing someone they care about is enough to trigger emotional withdrawal, even when they desire connection the most. But the fear of loss is not just about the prospect of someone leaving. It often speaks to a much deeper, more complicated relationship with past experiences. These experiences, especially those of loss, abandonment, or emotional trauma, can shape how we relate to people in the present, influencing our behavior in ways we don't always understand. At the heart of this fear is an unconscious belief that losing someone means losing a part of ourselves. This belief often stems from early childhood experiences, where emotional bonds with caregivers or loved ones were fragile or unpredictable. When children experience abandonment, neglect, or the loss of an important figure in their lives, they internalize the idea that love is not guaranteed, and that attachment comes with the inevitable risk of pain. As they grow older, this fear of loss continues to shape their relationships, even if they aren't fully aware of it. Carl Jung's concept of the wounded healer sheds light on this pattern. According to Jung, the wounds we suffer in early life are often the catalysts for personal growth. However, if these wounds remain unaddressed, they can manifest in unhealthy ways, affecting our ability to form trusting, intimate relationships. For many, the pain of past loss is buried deep in the unconscious mind, but it continues to affect how they react to emotional closeness. The more someone experiences the fear of loss without confronting it, the more they are likely to push others away when they feel themselves getting too close to the possibility of real intimacy. The fear of loss can create an inner conflict that is often difficult to reconcile. On one side, there is the desire to connect with others, to experience the warmth and closeness that comes with love. On the other side, there is the profound fear that this connection will only lead to pain. The mind creates a protective mechanism, withdrawing emotionally before the person has a chance to get too close, all in an attempt to avoid the possibility of feeling the deep hurt of loss once again. It becomes a cycle. The fear of loss pushes the person to withdraw, and this withdrawal creates the very emotional distance that reinforces the belief that relationships are painful and transient. This fear of loss is intricately tied to the concept of attachment theory, which examines how early relationships with caregivers shape our ability to form and maintain connections with others. For those with anxious attachment styles, the fear of loss is a constant companion. These individuals may find themselves in a cycle of emotional highs and lows, desperately seeking closeness with others but fearing that this closeness will ultimately lead to abandonment. For those with avoidant attachment styles, the fear of loss may manifest as emotional withdrawal or detachment, an attempt to preserve independence and avoid the vulnerability that comes with deep emotional connection. In both cases, the underlying issue is the same: a deep-seated fear of losing someone they care about, rooted in early childhood experiences of inconsistency, abandonment, or emotional neglect. Jung's notion of the anima and animus further explains how our unconscious emotional fears can shape our relationships. For a man struggling with the fear of loss, his anima, the inner feminine aspect, may long for emotional connection and intimacy. However, his animus, the inner masculine aspect, may push him to maintain control and distance, fearing that emotional involvement will lead to loss and pain. This internal conflict often manifests in relationships as emotional push and pull. One moment he's close, affectionate, and engaged, and the next he's distant, avoiding vulnerability and the potential for hurt. The fear of loss becomes so overwhelming that it overrides the desire for connection, leading to withdrawal. The fear of loss also connects to a deeper existential fear, the fear of non-existence. To lose someone is, in some ways, to confront the possibility of being alone in the world without the emotional bonds that give life meaning. This fear is particularly pronounced for those who lack a strong sense of self-worth or have not fully developed emotional resilience. The thought of being alone, emotionally, physically, or spiritually, can feel like a threat to their very identity. It is in these moments of vulnerability that the fear of loss becomes a barrier to emotional intimacy. The desire to keep people at arm's length is a way of protecting oneself from the imagined devastation of being left behind. Yet, paradoxically, it is in facing the fear of loss that true healing and growth can occur. Jung believed that in order to achieve individuation, the process of becoming whole, we must confront our unconscious fears and integrate them into our conscious selves. For someone who fears loss, this means acknowledging the emotional wounds of the past, allowing oneself to grieve, and learning to trust in the process of life and relationships. It's not an easy journey, but it is through this confrontation with our deepest fears that we can learn to form healthier, more resilient connections. The key to overcoming the fear of loss is acceptance, the acceptance that loss is an inevitable part of life. Every relationship, every connection carries with it the possibility of pain and heartbreak. But this does not mean we must close ourselves off from love or withdraw emotionally to protect ourselves from that pain. Rather, it means embracing the impermanence of life and learning to live in the present moment, cherishing the connections we have while also acknowledging that they may not last forever. This acceptance does not make the pain of loss any less real, but it allows us to approach relationships with a sense of openness and vulnerability, rather than fear and avoidance. In the next chapters, we will explore how individuals can learn to face the fear of loss and embrace the uncertainty that comes with love. We will discuss practical ways to build emotional resilience, heal from past wounds, and develop the trust necessary to form deep, lasting connections. The fear of loss may never fully disappear, but it is through understanding and accepting it that we can create space for true intimacy and personal growth. In the end, it is not the absence of loss, but the ability to love and connect despite it that defines the depth of our relationships. Have you ever found yourself feeling like you have to hide parts of yourself from someone you care about? The fear that if they saw the real you, they might not love you or accept you? For many, this fear runs deeper than simply worrying about a potential rejection. It's tied to an even more fundamental fear, the fear of being seen. This fear isn't just about physical appearance or surface-level judgments, it's about being truly seen, emotionally and psychologically, for who you are at your core. It's the fear that the raw, unpolished version of yourself, the version that's vulnerable, imperfect, and struggling, will not be worthy of love or respect. And when this fear becomes overwhelming, it can cause emotional distance and withdrawal, even in the midst of a desire for connection. At its core, the fear of being seen is deeply rooted in self-doubt and self-criticism. This is a powerful dynamic that influences how we engage with others, particularly in romantic or close relationships. Many people fear that if they let someone truly see them, without the protective layers of charm, strength, or accomplishment, those flaws and insecurities will be exposed. These parts of us, often hidden even from ourselves, are the aspects that we deem unworthy, unlovable, or unacceptable. But this perception of the self is rarely accurate. Instead, it reflects our internalized fears and judgments about ourselves. Judgments often shaped by past experiences, societal pressures, and the narratives we've created about who we are supposed to be. For some, this fear of being seen stems from early childhood experiences. If someone grew up in an environment where they were criticized, neglected, or emotionally abandoned, they may develop an intense fear of showing their true selves. They learn to hide their vulnerabilities, believing that showing them will lead to rejection or punishment. This could manifest in relationships as emotional withdrawal, an unwillingness to fully engage, or even a tendency to push others away when things begin to get too close. The idea is that if they keep their true self hidden, they are less likely to be hurt. Carl Jung's work on the shadow is essential in understanding this phenomenon. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we repress or refuse to acknowledge because they are deemed too painful or uncomfortable. These are often the aspects of our personality that we perceive as weaknesses or flaws. In the context of emotional intimacy, the shadow can manifest as deep fears of inadequacy or feelings of unworthiness. When someone is afraid to be truly seen, it's often because their shadow is filled with these feelings. They are not just afraid of rejection, they are afraid that the rejection will confirm the worst fears they have about themselves. They fear that their imperfections will be exposed, and they will no longer be seen as worthy of love or affection. The fear of being seen is also tied to the broader concept of identity, specifically the identity we construct to present to the world. We often create a persona, a carefully curated image of who we want others to think we are. This persona can be built on a variety of factors: accomplishments, social status, appearance, or even the roles we play in relationships. It serves as a shield, protecting us from judgment and the vulnerability of being truly known. The problem, however, is that this persona is not the real us. It's a mask, one that hides our insecurities, doubts, and fears. And when someone begins to get too close to seeing beneath that mask, we may instinctively pull away. The fear of being seen becomes a defense mechanism that keeps us emotionally distant. This dynamic is particularly evident in people who struggle with perfectionism. Perfectionism is often a way to protect oneself from the fear of being judged or rejected. If everything is perfect, If we say the right things, do the right things, look the right way, then we can avoid the fear of being seen as flawed or inadequate. But perfectionism comes at a cost. It creates an emotional barrier between us and others because it's not possible to be perfect all the time. When we inevitably fall short of our idealized self, we feel exposed, vulnerable, and unworthy. This is when the fear of being seen becomes most intense, as it feels like our entire sense of self is at risk of crumbling. The fear of being seen is also linked to the fear of vulnerability, the fear of exposing ourselves emotionally. Vulnerability is often seen as weakness in many cultures, particularly for men who are socialized to be strong, stoic, and emotionally controlled. But the truth is, vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the gateway to deeper emotional connection. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we are allowing others to see us in our raw, unguarded form. This is when true intimacy can occur. However, for those who are afraid of being seen, vulnerability feels like an overwhelming risk, a risk that they will be judged, rejected, or abandoned once their true selves are exposed. But why does being seen feel so threatening? Jung suggests that the fear of being seen is tied to our fear of losing control. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we are essentially surrendering control over how others perceive us. We are giving them the power to form their own opinions, judgments, and conclusions about us. For many, this loss of control is terrifying. It can feel like a loss of autonomy, a loss of the carefully constructed image that they have worked so hard to maintain. The fear is not just about being seen, but about being seen in a way that doesn't align with the idealized self-image we've created. However, the key to overcoming this fear lies in accepting that being seen is not a threat to our worth. It is through allowing ourselves to be seen in all our imperfection that we form authentic connections with others. True intimacy requires the courage to show up as we are, not as the idealized version of ourselves, but as our authentic selves, flaws and all. Only by embracing vulnerability can we break through the emotional distance that the fear of being seen creates. In the next chapters, we will explore how to overcome the fear of being seen by learning to embrace our vulnerabilities and heal the wounds of self-doubt. It is only by allowing ourselves to be truly known, by allowing others to see us without our protective layers, that we can form meaningful, lasting relationships. The fear of being seen will never completely vanish, but by confronting it and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, we can create space for deeper connection, self-acceptance, and emotional freedom. Ultimately, it is in embracing our true selves that we find the love and acceptance we crave the most.